After tons of hours of playtime on Druid, I finally hit level 100 and I think I've figured out a way to make my version of a Storm Druid build very strong. This version of a Storm Druid plays in only human form and utilizes storm spells like a caster or a mage type class. For this Storm Druid build guide, we are going to start with our chosen hotbar skills. The first skill is the auto attack, and I chose to go with Storm Strike for a few reasons. First, it's a storm ability, which means the ability can trigger many of the beneficial buffs in the skill tree and Paragon board. Storm Strike also offers some damage reduction, has a chance to immobilize enemies, and can inflict vulnerability, which is especially useful for boss fights or clearing tanky elites. Next up is Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm is the skill the entire kit was built around. Lightning Storm is a core ability that can be channeled. The longer the ability is channeled, the more strikes per hit Lightning Storm gets, increasing the ability's overall damage. This ability is great for clearing large packs of mobs in any tier of the game. However, Lightning Storm uses Spirit, which is a Druid's version of mana, and so the build had to accommodate the Spirit needed to continue to use Lightning Storm as much as possible. Next up is the ability Poison Creeper, which has a passive effect and an active effect. Poison Creeper passively poisons enemies, causing them to take damage over time. However, actively using Poison Creeper causes immobilize and poison to all enemies hit by the ability. Enemies hit by Poison Creeper also increase your critical strike chance against them by 20%. Critical hit chance, crowd controls such as immobilize and poison all play an important role in the build. Next up is Cyclone Armor. Cyclone Armor is pretty straightforward. Passively, Cyclone Armor offers increased non-physical damage reduction, which can help with survivability. Actively, Cyclone Armor is a storm skill that provides damage and a knockback in dangerous situations. Cyclone Armor also applies a slow and a guaranteed vulnerability for 3 seconds that helps increase the damage of Lightning Storm against all enemies. To help survivability and defense, I chose to use the ability Earthen Bulwark. Earthen Bulwark provides a large barrier that absorbs damage, but more importantly provides you with Unstoppable. Unstoppable removes any control impairing effects and gives you the opportunity to move and heal, potentially saving you from an unnecessary death. For the last skill slot on your hotbar, there are 2 different options. The first one being the ultimate skill Cataclysm. Cataclysm is a high damage storm ability that knocks enemies back and applies vulnerability. In late game, I chose to go with this skill because the damage and vulnerability felt really good in high-tier Nightmare dungeons. However, the skill has a long cooldown. The other option is Hurricane. Hurricane causes damage around you for several seconds. Enemies hit by Hurricane are also slowed and have a chance to become vulnerable. Try both out and decide which one you prefer. In the next section, I will be going over the skill tree and explaining some of the passives I chose for the build. I'll also be hovering on each section for a few seconds so the video can be paused and the skill tree can be copied. The first 2 passives are Heart of the Wild and Wild Impulses. Heart of the Wild increases maximum spirit for Lightning Storm, and Wild Impulse increases the damage of skills that use spirit. Next up is Predatory Instinct, which increases critical hit chance against close enemies, and remember, critical hit chance is important for the build and for damage. The next passive, Ancestral Fortitude, is only to gain access to the connected passive, so only 1 point. The connected passive Vigilance gives a bonus 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using a defensive ability, and I used 2 in this build in the form of Earthen Bulwark and Cyclone Armor. The passive Elemental Exposure helps keep vulnerability up for damage. The passive Charged Atmosphere is also extra damage. The passive Electric Shock has two uses. One being that it gives all our lightning skills a chance to immobilize, and the other that immobilized enemies take extra damage. And the passive Bad Omen also increases damage when hitting vulnerable, immobilized, or stunned enemies. The next passive is Neurotoxin, and just 1 point to apply the slow to poisoned enemies. And the passive connected to Neurotoxin is Envenom. Envenom is good for damage as it increases critical strike damage against poisoned enemies by 30%. In the next section of the skill tree, the first passive I take is Defiance for 12% extra damage against elites, and the connected passive Circle of Life, as it provides a lot of self-healing while channeling Lightning Storm. And finally, the key passive I chose for my Storm Druid build is Earthen Might. With an aspect, Earthen Might also applies to Storm abilities. This means that Lightning Storm has a chance on hit to restore all of your spirit and cause guaranteed critical strikes for 5 seconds. That's big damage. The chance for this to happen is increased for crit hits, stuns, immobilizes, and when enemies are knocked back. Every skill except for Earthen Bulwark causes these effects, and I stack crit hit chance as much as possible, meaning Earthen Might's effect happens a lot. Now let's go over the Paragon board for my Storm Druid build. I'm not going to go into detail for every Paragon point, but I will show each page, explain some of the more important nodes, and show each of the glyphs I chose for the build. The majority of the nodes I chose on the Paragon board were to increase the damage of my Storm abilities. However, on the third Paragon board there are some really good options for increasing overall spirit and spirit regeneration. This includes the node Reclamation, which provides spirit regeneration on kill, useful for channeling Lightning Storm on groups of enemies. And finally, I will go over aspects, gem choices, and important stats to look for on gear to optimize the build. As mentioned before, the Earthen Might key passive aspect applies Earthen Might to Storm abilities. If you haven't gotten this aspect yet, use the perfect Storm key passive until you get it. Aspect of the Umbral is another incredible option for spirit regeneration in this build, as you are constantly crowd controlling enemies with almost every ability in the kit. As Lightning Storm is a core skill, the attack speed bonus from Accelerating Aspect can have 100% uptime. More attack speed, more lightning strikes. Lightning Dancer's aspect causes your Lightning Storm critical hits to spawn dancing bolts that seek out enemies. These bolts do a lot of extra damage as you are constantly critting with this build. Aspect of Intercom increases overall damage as you stand still. As Lightning Storm has to be channeled, this aspect helps ramp up the damage. And the rest of the aspects I chose to use are more defensive, as I wanted to be able to push harder content. Change them as you see fit for your playstyle. For gems, I went with reduced damage while crowd controlled and armor, as it has stopped me from dying many times. I went with plus armor in my accessories, as armor is much better than any of the other options for survivability currently. And in weapons, I went with critical hit damage against vulnerable enemies, as that was the best option for improving the damage of this build. Important stats to look for on gear are critical hit chance, critical hit damage, vulnerability damage, health, willpower, spirit regeneration, spirit reduction, Lightning Storm ability points, and then survivability stats such as armor and damage reduction. I also like movement speed on boots, as it helps me kite enemies and dodge ground effects such as fear. And that's pretty much it for the build. Let me know what you think.